Welcome to these PowerPoint slides that introduce you to the topic of organizational behavior. This is for my course at Knox College on organizational behavior. Let's start by defining what organizational behavior is all about. First of all, organizational behavior is not really a field of just psychology. It's an interdisciplinary field. So things that we'll be talking about this term will, of course, rely a lot on psychology, but there will also be components of anthropology and sociology, business, economics. It's very much an interdisciplinary field. And the primary question that this field addresses is how are the goals of the organization and the behaviors of the individuals affected by group dynamics and management style. So throughout the term, we're going to be looking at how organizations function and how individual workers and employees function, but we're really going to be focusing on the psychology of it. An organization is only as effective as the interactions of the people that make up that organization. And so we're going to be looking at things like conformity pressure and leadership style and the difference between individual versus group decision making. We'll be talking about how people respond to things like diversity. What are the things that contribute to job satisfaction and so forth. The goals of taking a course like this are to develop people skills in managers and future managers. People skills are important at every single level of the organization, and when things go wrong, they can go very wrong. Some studies suggest that when you ask people what the biggest source of stress for individuals at work are, the most frequent answer is their colleagues and their coworkers. And the inability to get along smoothly with other people can just suck the life out of your work experience day after day after day. So developing people skills can go a long way toward making workers happier, but also making organizations more successful. And so we're going to be dealing with things like how should an organization manage diversity in the workforce, and how are they going to deal with globalization? How can we improve customer service? How can we create a positive work environment so that our employees like coming to work every day and go home with an enhanced rather than damaged sense of well-being? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to behave ethically, whether we're talking about people at the top of the organization making big decisions, or whether we're talking to people down at the other end of the organization making smaller decisions every day about how they're going to deal with their colleagues and with the organization as a whole. For many years here at Knox, I only taught one course called Industrial Organizational Psychology, rather than two separate courses called Industrial Psychology and Organizational Behavior, like I now do. The problem I had was with each year, I was adding more and more in the way of readings and activities into the class, and it was just getting to be too much material for one course. So I finally decided to split it into two different classes. Some of you may have already taken the Industrial Psychology class, but those of you who have not may be interested in taking it in the future. So I'd like to spend a moment just to explain a little bit about how these two closely related courses are going to be different from each other. One of the first things I had to decide was which topics would go into an industrial psychology class and which ones would go into an organizational behavior class. So under industrial psychology, I cover research methods in the field. I cover something called job analysis. I look at legal issues and employee selection. I look at the recruiting and interviewing process. I talk quite a bit about psychological testing and its role in work organizations. I talk about how psychologists are involved in developing performance evaluation tools for business. I talk about the issue of training. I talk about the physical design of workspaces. What's the best way to design conference areas or offices to maximize the work experience of the people who use these spaces? I talk about work motivation and job stress. Now, you'll notice that most of the topics in industrial psychology are involved with how do we hire people for positions, and how do we match them to positions, and how do we train them for those jobs, and how do we evaluate their performance on those jobs. That's really what industrial organizational psychology in general is about, but in this case, industrial psychology in particular. Now, the topics of work motivation and job stress, I think, could easily go under either class. They would not be out of place in an organizational behavior class or an industrial psychology class, but to try to split the topics fairly evenly, I ended up putting those two topics under industrial psychology. Now, the course you're about to take, organizational behavior, is going to include workplace diversity. Now, this is related to the legal issues in employee selection that are talked about in industrial psych, but on this course, I'm going to focus specifically on issues related to diversity rather than other issues involving legal rules about employee selection. We're going to focus more on individual differences between people, how our differences in attitudes and personality and values influencing what goes on in the workplace. I'm going to look at the way organizations are put together. The structure of the organization has a lot to do with the experience of the people who work there. We're going to talk about organizational culture. What are the unwritten rules of the place, the values that everybody seems to have in common? And I'm going to talk about the difficulty of getting organizations to change and why that's stressful. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about communication, both communication throughout organizations, but also communication between individuals in person. Leadership and management style is going to be a very important topic in this course. We're going to talk about group dynamics and work teams. When you put a bunch of people together and expect them to get something done, a lot of psychology sometimes gets in the way. But if you organize things right, the psychology can make it happen even better. So we're going to examine that. We're going to be interested in decision-making, both decision-making by individuals and decision-making by groups. And we're going to look at the topics of power, politics, conflict, negotiation, the down and dirty stuff that goes on behind the scenes in any organization, including work organizations. And I'm also going to address the topic of job satisfaction. What makes people happy or unhappy on the job? So in a nutshell, that's what this course is going to be all about.